Okay, that looks like my first slide, so I'll get going. As some of you who were here last year might recall, purple is a code name. Whoa. Okay, feel free. Ta-da. Does it help at all? Do I have to stand like this? I can hold it for you. Thanks, but I think they'll get this going. Are you happy with it? Yeah, now. Whoa, cool. Thanks a lot. Okay, so this is just a brief overview of Purple. It's a simple code name we use for the project. Purple is about creating sort of an engine that runs plug-in code to make verse do things. It's basically a computational engine for verse. It's based on the verse data model, so all data you work with in Purple is verse native, so to speak. And it's kind of a different way to implement perhaps the internals of a 3D package. And it's very general. You can do other things with it too. And Purple lets programmers focus on the data processing that they want to do and don't bother with I/O or storage and so on. And it keeps the internals really separated from the user interface, which is a common design goal in many programs. And it does so by having a network connection between those, using verse, of course. And it's supposed to encourage distributed development, since anyone can write a plugin, hopefully. And this is a brief overview of the status of the project. It's been running since about May last year, and I showed an early version at last year's conference. There's been a single developer involved. That's me. And basically, Eskil said a couple of years ago that he wanted something like this. I think the wording in our official specification is verse scripting engine or something. And since the EU project got approved, someone had to actually implement that deliverable, and that's me. And the code base today is roughly 21,000 lines of C. It's exactly twice the size of last year. And it has a single dependency, verse. There's no external libraries used. And it's becoming fairly complete, I think. The API hasn't grown in a while. All I do is test it and fill out some remote corners and try to make it work. And the code is still public, as it has been from day one, in Blender CVS actually. And as I said, the API is in C. It's basically 200 functions or something, which you use to manipulate data and send it in and out. And today, if I were to restart it, I'd probably use Python for the API programming to make it even easier to do plugins, not require people to know C. But when I started with this, I didn't know Python at all. I actually picked up Python after last year's conference, since it seemed cool and since Brecht had these great verse bindings for it. But perhaps you could wrap it, so make Purple just load Python code and then wrap the C API to Python today, if you wanted to. And I tried to keep it fairly well documented. I use Doxygen, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So I get this documentation, so I can just show you a sample. A sample of how to click in the wrong place. I can show you some sample documentation for the API. For instance, these are the 7 node types in verse. Not sure if you can see that actually. Maybe I can. Yeah. So I can just jump into the geometry node, for instance, and show you there's a bunch of functions there to work with the geometry data. And if you click on one, you should get a longer description. Yeah, it's fairly basic stuff, but I tried to keep it documented in the source directly. And it has a side benefit, in my view, that it keeps the header file clean. There's no comments for each function in the header file isn't commented, which makes it easier to read, in my opinion, but that's very personal. And one thing with the Purple API is that it's far simpler than the Verse API, since the Purple engine sits there and covers your back a bit. It prevents you from all the round trips. Here's an example. If you were to create to code a cube to send up the data that represents a cube. On the left, you can see the steps necessary to do it with the plain verse API. It's like 8 steps, roughly speaking. And you have these 2 synchronization points where you have to wait for the verse server to do something. But if you do it in Purple, you don't have to wait. You can just go right ahead and do it step by step and create the cube in a fairly natural way. And then the Purple engine will sit behind the scenes and insert these wait states when it tries to synchronize what you did with the server. And it also cuts down on the number of functions needed, since both APIs are a bit callback-based. I wouldn't call the Purple API callback-based, actually, but you can't write a Purple plugin in less than 2 functions. But often you don't need more than 2. But with the Verse API, since there's like, I don't know how many network commands we have, around 100, I think. And typically you need to define a new callback function to listen to each as functions, as commands come in. So with this, you'd have to have one, for example, you have to have a main function. Whoops. You'd have your main function, and then you'd have to register callbacks, and then you have to have one callback to listen to the connect accept from the verse server, so that you know that you're online. And then you'd send off the command to create the nodes. Then you have to wait for the nodes to be created, so you know their IDs, the server-side identities. Then once you know those, you can create the layers. Then you have to wait for those to come back. And once they are created, you can fill in the data. And with Purple, you'll have 2 functions. One very short initializer that just describes your plugin to the engine, and then a single function, typically called compute, that just does all these operations, which is fairly neat, actually. It makes the code shorter and easier to read. And now I was going to, there's some interesting typography bug there. I think I tried to get Yuri's name correct, but I failed. Sorry about that. So I can try to run Purple with Yuri's verse blender, since that's pretty cool. At least I think so. And I just realized now, sitting in the audience, that for people who are not used to it, I'm afraid verse seems a bit complicated, since there's a lot of programs to get running. So the first thing I need to do is to start my verse server, like so. And then I might start the actual Purple engine. Basically another server type application that has no interface. So now it's running. Then I'll do some magic to save some work later on. Here we go. And next step would be to perhaps start the first blender. Oops, I always forget the window switch. This is a bit much for this small screen, but I'll see if I can manage to make something sensible. There we are. Then actually I think I'll start one more program just for the fun of it, which will be a simple verse renderer, which is basically just a client that subscribes to everything and renders it so you can see what's going on. And this is a very low-tech renderer, I might add. It does not compare to Eskill's advanced stuff. And I think I showed you this last year too, so it's still the same pretty random colors, as you'll see shortly. So now if I do this right, I should be able to connect to verse, right? And then I can create a monkey, seems to be the trend for today. And once I upload that, it should appear here. Okay, there we are. And there's some issue with the transformation and axis translation, I think, between Blender and Verse, or maybe my tools are broken. I'll talk to Jiri about that this afternoon, I think. So it'll be upside down for now, but who cares? All right, and this should be it seems to work, right? Okay, so next step is I'll actually start one more application. I just can't have enough. This is something I didn't have last year. It's a simple sort of client for Purple. Since you remember I told you had to separate the interface from the engine. And this is an example of such an interface. It's written in Python using Brecht's bindings and also using OpenGL for some rendering of stuff. So what I'll do is I'll connect to the Purple engine and tell it I want to edit one of the graphs it contains. Graphs are simply containers or documents. These are the plugins that the Purple server has told me it knows about. So I can create instances of these and make them do things. And for now I'll do something very, very simple. I'll just create an instance of node input, which simply inputs node data from the server. Then I'll run something called Crowder, which is basically what Jiri did in his demo. It creates linked copies of an object. And then I'll create an instance of something called node output. I'm not sure if you can read those at all. The text rendering here is not exactly high quality, but yeah, I think I'll have a pretty wee. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to connect the input nodes to this Crowder plugin and then connect the outputs back so they get sent up to the server. And I have this small little graph here. So now nothing has changed, and you might think, uh-oh, but I still need to provide the name of the node to input so it knows what to pick from the big copy of the verse database. So if I enter Suzanne there, we should see something. There we are. So what basically happened here is that the Crowder plugin created copies of the node it got, 8 copies, and put them in a surrounding pattern. And I can change the number of copies if I feel like it just by editing the inputs of this plugin. So if I wanted a wider grid, like 4, there's 4 by 3 and here's like 4 by 4. And these are only copies, so you don't duplicate the geometry. And I could probably download them into Blender as well, but I'll click myself to death. I can try it. Whoops. I don't use Blender all that much, so you'll have to excuse my slowness here. Here we are. We should see the copies. Yeah, there they are. So make them all appear in here. I think I'll actually leave it at that. And they should still be linked. So if I edit this one, for instance, yeah, thanks. And then there, you see that they are sharing the geometry. And do you see the change in the verse client? No, you don't, because there's too many windows. I'm editing the wrong side. How silly. It's because they're upside down here, so I have to look. There you go. It's some stupid transform bug there. So I think that's actually all I'm going to do with this. For now, I just wanted to show you that Purple can work on geometry supplied by Blender. Of course it can, but maybe it could be shown. Okay, I seem to have scrolled away here. No, here we are. Yeah. So one of the benefits here is that you can run. You don't have to do as much work. If you wanted to do this in Verse itself, you have to code more. I think I can actually geek out totally here and show you the code for this little Crowder plugin that created these copies. Just to give you a sense, here's the first page, and there's the end. So it's not a lot of code, it's just 2 functions. It spends most of its time reading inputs and just a couple nested for loops down here that create the copies. So it's fairly basic and straightforward. And you might think that you could do this operation straight in Blender, and so did I actually until last week when I asked Ton about it. And it turns out that since Verse Blender has access to the mesh data, it can do more than you can from Purple. Oh no, from Python, I'm sorry. I'm not very familiar with what you actually can do with Blender data in Python, but I think the Verse Blender connection is at a lower level or so it can access the mesh better. And yeah. And of course you can share the data with other Verse-enabled applications like My Simple Renderer. And here's just, I think I've said most of this already. Yeah, you saw that when I pulled the vertex in Blender, Purple noticed and reran, so the data was still there. Actually you didn't. Oh, never mind. Okay, this is a simple schematic of what I just did. It shows you the verse server in the center and the Blender client, so to speak, and the purple interface, and the engine sitting on the side here. So you can. This is how the programs were connected, more or less. And currently, I could only show you this operating on geometry, because that's all we have in Verse Blender right now. But Purple supports all the node types in Verse. So I have plugins that do, for instance, bitmap filtering and text. I don't think I have anything for text, but I could write some. So you can do a lot in Purple. And I'm really hoping for GD to get some bitmaps flowing into Purple or into Blender, so we can have some fun with that. Yeah, as GD said, there's currently no access control in Verse. There's no way to prevent people from messing with your data. But that's actually something we're working on in the EU project universe. So, and Eskil and I have a draft specification, a single page of what we'd like to be able to do there. So I hope something will show up in that department. And just to round it off, yeah, it would be fun if someone wanted to look into Purple or, I don't know, write a plugin or work on the user interface. We have this idea that it would be nice to integrate the Purple interface into Blender, into a view. So you could do this behind the scenes, plugins, connections inside the Blender interface. Or just break it and tell me. And as I said, all the code is in CVS. The documentation actually is not online right now, but I'll bug a ton about that. And that's the domain name we use. And I'm pretty much online myself. I'm in IRC and whatever. So yeah, any questions? Great. And you're very welcome to the developer session. I'll show you some more complicated things there, perhaps some bitmap operations or whatever that I couldn't do with Blender here. So if you're interested, you come by then and see more. Okay, thank you very much.